what I was really excited about when I was asking Stanley if he'd like to talk today is I said, you know, we're not really sure. We're interested in entheogens, we're interested in dreams, we're interested in parapsychology, we're interested in shamanism, and he sent back an abstract like 20 minutes later with all those words in it. So I'm pretty excited with what he's going to talk about today. So it's my pleasure and my honor, and if we could have a great big round of applause for Stanley Krippner.
Well, thank you so much, Larry, for that gracious introduction. But I have to give you folks a clue as to what happens to get these honors and awards. You simply join an organization, you pay your dues on time, you show up at the meetings, you don't make too many enemies, and before you know it, you get an award. Unfortunately, they're not monetary awards, but there's something to give people a chance to talk about when they make introductions, like Larry just And I'm glad that he reminded me what I'm supposed to talk about tonight, because I was trying to think of a way to tie in dreams and psychedelics and shamanism and parapsychology. And my interest in these topics do go to my earliest days, actually. I was interested in dreams when I was in high school. I actually recorded some of my dreams back in those days. Nobody else in my high school class shared that interest, but I was reading about dreams in popular psychology columns and magazines. And then in the mid-1950s, Life magazine had a photo essay by Gordon Wasson, a banker of all things from Boston, whose hobby was mushrooms, and he had been to Mexico and discovered that the psychedelic mushrooms were still being used by a group in Oaxaca, and there were photographs under a different name of a woman who was really Maria Sabina, arguably the most famous and important shaman of the 20th century. Little did I know that some 40 years later I would be interviewing Maria Sabina, and probably took the last photographs of her before she died at the ripe old age of 94, 95. Nobody knows for sure. They didn't keep very good birth records when she was born. But also, back in those days, I was interested in parapsychology because I really desperately wanted a set of encyclopedia, and my parents ran a farm in rural Wisconsin, didn't have the money to buy a set of encyclopedia, and I was thinking, oh, who do I have that I can borrow the money from? And I had one rich relative, my Uncle Max, and then I thought, no, I can't borrow money from Uncle Max because he's dead. And just at that moment, the telephone rang, and my mother answered it and broke out in tears because her niece, Uncle Max's daughter, had just phoned saying that he had dropped dead of a heart attack at a fairly young age. Well, I was a little bit of shock. I didn't tell people about that for many, many years, but I did start to read about parapsychology, clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition, and the like. But also on our farm, when my father would go plowing with a horse and a plow before he could afford a tractor, he would unearth Indian arrowheads, and so I began reading about the Native Americans that lived in that area. And you start reading about Native Americans, you read about medicine men, medicine women. So I had an interest in all of those topics even before I went to college. When I was a graduate student at Northwestern University, they came together in a very unusual way. One of my professors, William McGovern, was a very, very colorful and interesting professor, and he is now known for his book Jungle Paths and Inca Ruins, just been reissued, even though he wrote it before I was born, his explorations in the Peruvian Amazon. But he was telling us about how he would go into these Amazonian tribes, and one time when he was visiting the tribe, they let him into what they called a kapa session, which we all know as ayahuasca. Banisteriasis caapi is one of the two active ingredients of ayahuasca, as many of you know. And the shaman of that tribe had a vision of a funeral procession in a tribe that was 100-some miles away, because their chief had died unexpectedly, and they were in great mourning, and they were having a special ceremony assuring his transition to the other world. Well, I thought, well, that must be something like these mushrooms that Maria Sabina is known for. And again, little did I know that some decades in the future I would be actually drinking ayahuasca in the Amazon in Brazil. So Professor McGovern also told us about the use of dreams in those tribes and how they believed that dreams took them into another reality. And so that particular class and that particular series of lectures really tied together psychedelics and shamanism, dreams, and parapsychology. And I was very lucky to have known William McGovern and to be invited to his home, where he would regale us with marvelous stories about his adventures. He was arguably the first Euro-American to visit the forbidden city of Lhasa in Tibet. This was even before the Chinese took over Tibet. And he wrote another book, To Lhasa in Disguise. He was blonde and blue-eyed. Well, it was easy to dye his hair black. It wasn't easy to dye his blue eyes brown, and this was before the days of contact lenses. So he put lemon juice in his eyes, and they became so bloodshot nobody could tell what color his eyes were. And then he just entered on his own as a trader and mingled with the crowd, took copious notes about what life was like in the Forbidden City, and everything was going along pretty well until one of the very sharp Lhasas noticed his eyes, beneath all of the bloodshot coloration, were really blue, and wanted to investigate him, and he literally escaped with his life. But that gave him material for yet another book. So I was interested in Eastern traditions, Eastern spirituality, when I was at both the University of Wisconsin, Northwestern University, but we didn't have any courses on the topic, and nobody really took that too seriously. Well, that led me to reading the books by Alan Watts, which were available then, and when I was at Northwestern University, I discovered that he had been the Episcopalian chaplain at Northwestern University. And again, little did I know that some decades later I would not only meet him, but we'd become good friends. In fact, it was Alan Watts who brought me to the California Institute for Asian Studies and introduced me to Dr. Chaudhuri many, many years ago. And so this school now, of course, CIIS, has a very, very special place in my memories. Well, once I got on with my career as a psychologist, I actually found ways of studying all of these phenomena, and both qualitatively and quantitatively. I'm going to just give you a little brief recap of the research, and if you want more information, ask me during the question period, which will be fairly lengthy, because I'll have a very, very short lecture for you. Or just go to my website, because I have several of the articles on my website, stanleykrippner.weebly.com. But when I was invited to direct a dream laboratory at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn, we had to find some way of studying telepathic effects in dreams in a way that could be statistically analyzed. And so I and the team of people who I worked with found a method of having a dreamer in a soundproof room attached to electrodes so his or her dreams could be monitored, and then a tape recording made of the dreams, typed, this was in the days before word processors, and sent out to judges who would look at all of the possible target pictures, which were usually art prints, and rank them in terms of their closeness to the dream reports. And over the course of 10 years, we published some 100 articles, a monograph, and a book on the topic. And you'd expect the right target to come maybe 50% of the time, because there are usually two target pictures, and the judges and the dreamer would have to pick one of them. But in our studies, a couple of hundred sessions, they came up 75% of the time. And that's 25% in excess of what you'd get by chance, and the odds are actually several 100,000 to 1 in terms of that being chance. And other laboratories tried to replicate our work. Some did, some didn't. But an analysis of all of that attempted replication has now been published in a journal that I edit, not a journal, a book series I edit, Advances in Parapsychological Research, Volume 9. I've always said that I would retire after Volume 10 came up, and Volume 10 is in progress right now. And it's one of these projects that loses money. We never sell enough books to make any money. But, you know, libraries buy them, interested people buy them, and we do keep people in touch with the latest in parapsychological research. Well, the other work that I've done in dreams has been to examine gender differences, because I've given dream workshops in a number of different countries, and I ask people to contribute one of their dreams to the collection of dreams, because once we have 100 male dreams and 100 female dreams, we can do an analysis of the dream difference using a scale called the Hall-Van de Castle scale, which scores dreams for content on 50 different items. And we have published our analysis of dreams from England, from the United States, from Brazil, from Argentina. We're still working on Russia, Ukraine, and Japan. And what we find out seems fairly obvious, but it really isn't. What we find out is that women dream more about babies, more about children. Men dream more about weapons, more about the office where they work or the factory where they work. You know, isn't that obvious? No, it's not obvious, because back in the old days, it was thought that dreams were complete nonsense. They were just random images. And now we're finding out that dreams do reflect everyday experience. This might be common sense today, but back when I was in college, it was not common sense. And dreams were not taken seriously. One of my psychology professors even said that the only use for dreams is if they're in color or not, because if they're in color, that's a sure sign of schizophrenia. Well, my friends and I looked at each other because, of course, we all had dreams in color. And that was one of my earliest clues that you don't believe everything your professors tell you. So I've done a lot of quantitative work with dreams over the years, and in parapsychology over the years. And what about shamanism? Well, actually, I have visited, or actually worked with, over 100 shamans, about half of them women, by the way, from all 6 inhabited continents. And I have been able to do a little bit of psychophysiological research with one of the shamans. And that was with a shaman in Brazil by the name of Pai Li, who was very gracious and allowed us to attach electrodes to his head and to other parts of his body to monitor the heartbeat rate and the pulse and the electrodermal skin response. And when he called the spirits in, everything changed very, very dramatically. And then he also let us work with the mediums that were in his entourage. And the mediums filled out fairly detailed questionnaires for us, and they refused money. They said that they would do this for, the benefit of science and to give some acknowledgement of their work. And again, we were getting some very, very interesting quantitative differences in terms of the gender breakdowns, and not as much difference between men and women as one might suspect. And this is the only study that actually used the Kinsey scale to find out if there was a difference in terms of people who were high heterosexual, high homosexual, or someplace in the middle. And again, no difference. Sexual orientation didn't seem to affect their shamanizing and their incorporation of spirits. What did seem to be the variable was the number of years that they were incorporating spirits. And that is where we found the longer time that they were involved in incorporating spirits, the higher their scores were on the dissociation scale and the absorption scale. In other words, they were able to shift into these altered states of consciousness more or less at will very easily, and they were able to dissociate very easily. Now, in American culture, we would think, well, that's a sure sign of schizophrenia. Again, if something's unusual, we blame it on schizophrenia. No, it just shows the Brazilian mediums are able to shift consciousness very easily, and it's not pathological at all. In fact, for the female mediums, it's a source of empowerment because it's in the poor sections of Brazil, it's one of the few avenues that's open to female power. If you can become a Mãe de Santos, a mother of the spirits, that gives you prestige in the community, and also it gives your, shall we say, intuitive gifts and your gifts of compassion and love a very worthwhile outlet, because that's the only type of psychotherapy that many of the people are able to get. Well, and then what about the psychedelics? I and one of my Saybrook students did the first quantitative study of ayahuasca. We took first-person reports of ayahuasca experiences, and we scored the experience on a scale that a different Saybrook student had devised, a scale that measures spiritual content in dreams and other altered states. And so we were able to come up with an assessment of the ayahuasca experiences and found that, yes, most of them had a lot of spiritual content on all 5 of the variables. This is published on my website, also in the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies. Well, in addition to the quantitative studies, I've done a lot of qualitative work. I've written many case studies, first-person reports, participant observation reports. And when I go into one of these unusual cultural settings, I just don't stand back and observe if they'll let me participate. Of course, I'm always delighted to do so. When I was in Brazil very recently, I was able to participate in a session with a shaman from the Shavati tribe, and it was preceded by a lovely dance with the very, very profound and beautiful music. And no, there was no ayahuasca there, but there was chanting and there was drumming. And I often carry along a little portable drum with me. You never know when I'll be called upon to use it. So I was drumming along with the rest of them. It was all very profound and all very festive. And then I also went to visit the Guarani Indians in southern Brazil. And the Guarani also had a dance. And the Guarani women are very beautiful and very tall, so the dance was extremely elegant and very moving. And then the shaman, whose name was Paulo Guarani, took out a pipe and put some smoking mixture into it and took a drag on the pipe and then passed it on to me. Well, of course, I was eager to have an experience. I had no idea what was in the mixture, but if the Indians have used it for hundreds of years without eradicating their tribe, it must be safe. So I took some puffs on the pipe and passed it on, other members of our group, and then the shaman knocked the mixture out of the pipe and put a different smoking mixture in, and lit it, and again passed it on to me, and I tried it, passed it on. I mean, I had to be a role model for people in our group who had come with me so that they could see it was safe. If I didn't drop dead, they would know that they should take it themselves. And then the shaman knocked out the smoking mixture, put in a third smoking mixture, and passed it around. All of these mixtures were entirely different. I didn't know, what would happen, what sort of visions I would have, if I'd stay in my body and go out of my body, had no idea. And then I thought, okay, now we've had 3 smoking mixtures, but that wasn't it. Then he took a gourd, and in the gourd there was a brew of some sort, and he took a quaff of it, and I took a quaff of it. We went around, and then he took a different gourd, a different mixture. And that went around, and then a third gourd. So, here, I'd had 6 unknown psychoactive substances, and I was waiting for the effects. He said, now, you're in a very spiritual state, and so I'd like each of you to give a prayer. Well, he started on the other side, so that gave me a chance to work through my prayer while the other people were responding. Now, I then realized that that smoking mixture and that brew wasn't going to give me any visions, but it was giving me perfect mental clarity. I'm not very fluent in Portuguese, but the words did come back to me that night, and that clarity was just incredible. It lasted for about 2 weeks. I just wish I could bring it up to San Francisco with me. And, of course, it would be wonderful if someone would market it and give the money to the Indians, which I really doubt they would do. But when it came time for me to give my prayer in Portuguese, I would say, well, I pray for the Guarani young people, and I pray that they stop hanging themselves from trees and committing suicide as a protest against the developers who are disobeying Brazilian law, who are tearing up the land, cutting down the trees, and putting in crops. That's not in accord with the law, and that's not in accord with the forces of nature. And so I am praying that they will find a more militant way to stop this. And the shaman was really surprised. He said, how did you know about our young people doing that? I said, well, I'm a member of the Rainforest Action Network, and our newsletter is filled with stories like this from all over the world. So, of course, I knew this before I came down. Well, believe it or not, he took that story back to the tribe, and I don't want to brag or anything, but there hasn't been a suicide since. And I also, later on, and I had to do this in English because the story is much too complicated, but you can read about it in my book, The Voice of Rolling Thunder. My dear friend Rolling Thunder, who is a Native American medicine man who lectured several times in San Francisco, found that the developers were cutting down piñon nut trees and the piñon nut trees, the pine nut trees, the poor Indians need for protein. And so they were being deprived their land. This was all, again, against U.S. law, but, it's low priority for law enforcement officers. And so Rolling Thunder did a couple of things. He did not use force, he did not use violence, but he came up in the middle of the night and photographed the tractors and the bulldozers, and because they did their work at night, and then had somebody take this to Washington, D.C., And then the next week, his people put sand into the motors of the bulldozers and the tractors so they wouldn't work. That was very effective, and of course the sand jammed up the work so well that they were out of commission. And the only person they found in Washington who would look at the video film was Senator Ted Kennedy. And he actually put pressure upon Richard Nixon, and believe it or not, Nixon gave a personal order that this had to stop. Now, Richard Nixon, for all of his shortcomings, was one of the best friends the Indians ever had in the White House. He did many things for Indians. He stopped the practice of forced adoptions. Why was he so good to Indians? Because he had a football coach who was a Native American. And he was always bragging about how his Native American football coach taught him the principles of fair play. Well, probably an embarrassment, and the football coach found out about that. But at least Rolling Thunder's people got some benefits from that. In my work, I not only do the scientific research, I'm very much of an activist, and I was just in New York City, and I was talking to a group of activists who run a center for at-risk young people and turn them into performers, singers, dancers, actors, get them off the street, get them on the stage. It's a very inspirational group. And I was talking about some of the political activism that I've done in connection with these other activities. I was in Brazil for a workshop at a center called the City of Peace, and by sheer serendipity, the weekend that I was there, there was a conference of some 100 shamans from the rainforest because they had to address something very alarming that was going on. A team of doctors, supposedly from Harvard, came in, and the chief doctor told the medicine man or medicine woman, I want to learn about the herbs. Can you take me into the rainforest? And so the shaman would go into the rainforest, and then the other doctors and nurses would tell people, we were going to give you some vaccinations to protect you against diseases. So they had their needles, and they injected the needles, and people thought that they'd been vaccinated. This was such good work, and they were all in favor of being vaccinated. And those who didn't believe in vaccination thought, well, we'll make the gringos happy, and if they want to vaccinate us, they can. Then the shaman came back in, and they said, well, we've just been vaccinated. They took some blood out of our body. And the shaman took blood out. When you vaccinate somebody, you put something into the blood. You don't take blood out. And then the shamans knew that their blood had been stolen from them. And a few weeks later, on the Internet, they were selling blood samples to industrial firms who had workers in the tropical areas of the world, thinking that maybe there was something in the blood that could be synthesized or used in some way to keep the workers from coming down with fatigue or with heat-related diseases. And did any of this money go back to the Indians? No. Well, this conference was being held to draft a proclamation of indigenous rights. This was only one of the ways that the Indians were being ripped off. Their land was being ripped off too, and other transgressions. And so, at the end of all of this, I'd gotten to talk to some of the shamans, again in my more or less Portuguese, because the Indians all speak Portuguese very well as their own dialect. And so they said they wanted me to take the proclamation back to the United States. They said they know how to publicize it in Brazil, but the problem wasn't in Brazil. The problem was back in the United States, and especially Harvard University. So I took it back. I had it translated into English. I had it published in half a dozen publications and then put it on the Internet. And then all hell broke loose. Did I get static from Harvard and the industrial companies? They said, oh no, this wasn't ours. Harvard completely backed out. They said, these people might have an affiliation with Harvard, but Harvard was in no way responsible for this. And the industrial firms that had put it on the internet said, well, this is so legitimate. We were doing this for humanitarian purposes. And the people from Harvard collected this with all full disclosure, which of course was a lie. But it worked. It worked because I had friends going to Brazil on 2 different occasions to do medical work, to actually do legitimate medical work to the Native Americans in Brazil. And at the border, they were stopped and their equipment was examined, and they were said, we don't want you to take any blood from our Indians. So I knew that the message had struck home. So these are a few of the things that you run into when you actually mingle, and many of you have probably done field research yourself, you actually mingle with indigenous people, and you do get drawn into their struggles, especially the struggles that they have with what I call cultural colonialism, where their culture in some way or another is being ripped off. And I make sure that any of my students that go to work with indigenous people always give something back. When people would come to visit Rolling Thunder, I always made sure that they brought him some financial gifts or his favorite pipe tobacco, which was Three Brothers natural pipe tobacco. And so it was not only getting, it was always giving, because Rolling Thunder never charged people for a healing. He would just leave it open to the person to give what they would like to give. And I'll tell you one more story, and then I'll just move ahead. Our book, The Voice of Rolling Thunder, which I wrote with Rolling Thunder's grandson, didn't have a cover. And one of the last people we interviewed for the book was Carrie, a photographer by the name of Carrie, and he had been given 3 months to live by his physician. He had a very rare blood disease. So in desperation, he went to see Rolling Thunder, and he said to Rolling Thunder, I know you don't like being photographed. I'm not here to photograph you. I'm here to learn from you and try to save my life, because the doctors can't do anything for me. So Rolling Thunder put him through a lot of purifications and sweat lodges and prayers and chanting and herbal medicines. At the end of 3 months, he was still alive. At the end of 6 months, he was still alive. And he went to a clinic. They found no trace of his disease. So this was time for him to leave Rolling Thunder and get back to work. So on the very weekend that he was to leave Rolling Thunders, one of the people at the camp came running up with a little eagle, and the eagle had fallen out of the nest. And the eagle was injured. You could see that the eagle's wing it looked broken to them. And they had the eagle in a paper sack, and the eagle was squawking and screaming and yelling. And he said, let's take this to Rolling Thunder. So they took the eagle to Rolling Thunder, and Rolling Thunder took the eagle out of the bag, and the eagle quieted down immediately. And then Rolling Thunder said to Carrie, now you can take your photograph. Carrie took the photograph. A moment after you took the photograph, the eagle flew off into the tree back to the nest. The eagle with the broken wing flew back to the nest. And that's the picture that's on the cover of our book, The Voice of Rolling Thunder. So that came at just the right time. If you get involved with shamanism, you find that they have a time of their own, and they have a serendipity about them that can sometimes be pretty amazing. Well, when I was in New York City, I was hosting an artist and actor friend of mine from Sweden, and so I took him to a lot of experimental theater, and I said, well, I bet that I think that we'll have a very special treat for you, because I have some artist friends, Alex and Allison Gray, and they're inviting us to join them in upstate New York for their Full Moon Festival. And so he was very excited because of course, he knew the work of Alex Gray, and I noticed you have some of his books in your bookstore here. And he was very, very happy that I'd be able to come and see his new site, which is incredible. That's a whole other story, but they're actually going to reconstruct a building for a temple of sacred mirrors. And when we were up there for the Full Moon Festival, Allison Gray actually did a Jewish Seder as part of the ceremony.